The screams echoed through the steel hallways of Rikers Island. Guards shouted commands, inmates pounded on their cell doors, and somewhere in the chaos, a young man named Darnell Wilson clung to the bars, his voice cracking as he begged for help. Smoke was filling the air from a fire set in one of the dorm blocks. Someone had thrown a mattress against the metal door, flames licking the edges, and the sprinklers weren't working. Darnell's cellmate coughed beside him, gasping for air. From down the tier, another voice yelled, "They don't care about us! We're dying in here!" Outside the cell, a guard hesitated. He didn't have the keys. No one did. The officer who had them was trapped on the other side of the block. As sirens blared and chaos spread, Darnell realized something chilling. No one was coming. That night would be remembered as one of the worst riots in Rikers history, a moment that showed the world just how broken New York City's jail system had become. But the question everyone later asked was, how did Rikers Island, once meant to fix people, turn into a symbol of everything wrong with the city's justice system? To understand that, we have to go back to the days before the fire, before the anger boiled over. Rikers Island wasn't always the place people feared. When it opened in the 1930s, the city promised it would be different, a place where inmates could be rehabilitated. But as years passed, things changed. The jails grew overcrowded. New York's crime rates soared in the 1980s and 1990s, and soon Rikers became packed with young men, many of them awaiting trial, not yet convicted of anything. Darnell Wilson was one of them. He was only 19 when he first arrived, skinny, quiet, and scared. He hadn't even gone to trial yet. The guards told him to keep your head down and do your time, but time at Rikers was never peaceful. The walls seemed to hum with tension. From the first day, Darnell saw fights break out over food, over beds, even over the television remote. Some of the older inmates ran their own rules, their own systems of control. The guards looked the other way. Everyone said the same thing. This place will change you. At night, the noise never stopped. Metal doors slammed. People shouted for medical help. And sometimes, you'd hear a sound that froze your blood, a scream that no one answered. Darnell started writing letters to his mother, promising he'd come home soon. But deep down, he wasn't sure he would. One day, a new inmate arrived, Marcus Jones, tall, confident, and known around the city for being part of a gang from Harlem. Marcus wasn't afraid of anyone, not even the guards. He told Darnell, "You got to stand up for yourself in here, or they'll eat you alive." At first, Darnell tried to stay out of trouble, but in Rikers, trouble came looking for you. The food trays were cold, the showers broken, and the guards were stretched too thin to care. Rumors spread that a new warden was coming, a man who wanted to crack down on inmate behavior. The inmates called it a war waiting to happen. Then one afternoon it began. A fight broke out in the mess hall, two men throwing punches over stolen food. But it didn't stop there. Within minutes, more joined in. Chairs flew, alarms sounded, and guards rushed in swinging batons. Darnell ducked under a table, heart racing, as Marcus shouted for him to run. But there was nowhere to go. The doors slammed shut, locking everyone inside. Smoke filled the air as someone lit a piece of cloth on fire, and panic swept the room. Darnell looked around at the chaos, the guards fighting to hold the line, the inmates yelling in fear and anger, and he realized that this wasn't just a fight. This was a message. The people inside were tired of being ignored, beaten, and forgotten. As the fire spread and the alarms blared, Darnell pressed himself against the wall, coughing, eyes burning from the smoke. Somewhere behind the noise, he heard Marcus shouting his name, then a loud crash, followed by silence. Darnell turned toward the sound, his heart pounding. What he saw made his blood run cold. Marcus lay on the ground, barely moving. Smoke twisted through the air like grey snakes, and the smell of burning plastic filled the room. Darnell stumbled toward him, coughing so hard he could barely breathe, "Marcus!" he shouted, shaking his shoulder. Marcus's eyes flickered open for just a second. "Get out!" he whispered, before another crash made Darnell look up. A ceiling panel had fallen, sparks raining down from the broken lights. The whole block was turning into a trap. The guards were yelling for backup, but their radios weren't working. Everyone was screaming, some in anger, some in fear. In that moment, Rikers wasn't a jail anymore. It was a battlefield. Darnell dragged Marcus toward the corner, away from the fire. The steel bars were hot to the touch. He shouted for help, but no one came. Somewhere in the distance, a loud explosion shook the floor. It wasn't from a bomb. It was a gas line bursting under the pressure of the flames. Darnell covered his face with his shirt, his lungs aching. He could hear people praying. Then, finally, the heavy door burst open. A squad of guards in gas masks stormed in, yelling commands. They sprayed the flames with foam and pulled out a few men who were still conscious. One of the guards grabbed Darnell by the arm and dragged him out. He looked back at Marcus, who was still lying there, but the guard shouted, "Move!" As they reached the hallway, the sound of the fire alarms was deafening. Inmates were lined up against the walls, coughing and crying. The smell of smoke and fear hung heavy. Darnell's hands were shaking. He couldn't stop thinking about what Marcus said before passing out. Get out. That riot became one of the darkest days in Rikers' long, violent history. News cameras later showed the burned walls, the melted locks, and the blackened hallways. Reporters stood outside the island, calling it a war zone in the middle of New York City. Families of inmates stood by the fences, demanding answers. The city promised investigations, reforms, and new leadership. But the people inside, guards and prisoners alike, knew it was only the latest chapter in a story that had been repeating for decades. Weeks later, Darnell sat in the medical wing, his arm bandaged from burns. He stared out through the tiny window, watching the ferries move across the East River. The skyline of Manhattan shimmered in the distance, so close, yet impossibly far. He could hear other inmates whispering about what would happen next. Some said the mayor wanted to shut Rikers down. Others said it would never happen. One day, a young reporter came to visit. She was doing a story on the riot, asking about the conditions inside. Darnell didn't want to talk at first, but then she said, "People out there think Rikers is just a jail. What do you think it is?" Darnell looked at her for a long time before answering. "It's not just a jail," he said quietly. "It's a warning." He told her about the nights without sleep, the fights that never ended, and the feeling that no one cared whether you made it out alive. He spoke about Marcus, the friend who stood up when others were too afraid. When the reporter left, she promised his story would be told, and it was. Within months, headlines across New York read, "Inside Rikers Island, a system broken beyond repair." People began calling it a symbol of everything wrong with the city's justice system. Politicians gave speeches. Protesters marched across the bridge leading to the island. But still, the doors of Rikers stayed locked, and new buses arrived each week, filled with more young men like Darnell. Years later, when Darnell finally got out, he stood on the ferry dock and looked back at the island one last time. The grey buildings looked small from a distance, almost peaceful, but he knew better. He thought about all the people still trapped inside, the ones who would never get their stories told. He thought about Marcus, about the guards who tried to help and the ones who didn't. Rikers Island had started as a promise. It ended as a symbol of what happens when justice forgets about mercy and when punishment becomes more important than people. As the ferry pulled away, Darnell whispered to himself, "No one should ever come back here." Behind him the island sat in silence, its secrets buried under years of pain, its walls still holding the echoes of the past. Rikers had become more than just a jail. It had become the reflection of New York City's justice system itself. scarred, complicated, and desperately in need of change. And for Darnell, it would always be the place where he learned the hardest truth of all. Sometimes, the fight for justice starts in the darkest place imaginable. The end.